You know, the Messiah will come when we can do this in a synagogue basement somewhere.
Yeah, really.
Hey, you could have done it in my
You
show
know.
anytime.
So, yeah, it's always Muslims, Christians, and Jews. What about the other 47 religions in the world? They don't come into the
They
equation.
count, absolutely.
Okay. At any
And the
rate,
atheists and the humanists and
yeah. So I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, as you've heard, and I'm not a native-born Israeli, as you can also hear. I come from northern Minnesota originally. They call us the Frozen Chosen. And but I've been in Israel now for about 40 years. It's my time in the wilderness. Now I'm about to pass into the promised land and, I don't know, move to Brooklyn or something. But I've been in Israel all these years, and I'm an anthropologist by profession. So what I'd like to do tonight, I guess it's always a problem for me because almost everybody in the world has heard me speak about 3 times. So I don't want to repeat and start on Occupation 101, but on the other hand, often there are people, and I think tonight there might be some as well, that haven't heard me speak, maybe. There's still a few left. And that doesn't have, all the background. So I'm going to try to sort of pitch it in the middle between, giving a certain context and analysis and background, and at the same time, making it at a high enough level that we can have, even if you have heard me speak, it'll be a productive evening. So what I'd like to do is to begin with a sort of an overview of what the conflict is all about, and especially what's happening on the ground. And then we'll have that short intermission. Are we passing a hat tonight at all?
Yes.
Is anybody? Yes.
It isn't actually an intermission, it's an interlude.
Interlude. All right. So sign the petition and fill up the hat, and then we'll have time for discussions and everything. And I'll talk a little bit about, maybe then I can talk a little more about house demolitions themselves. So let's. I just dropped this. One second. My remote. And I guess gotta put this together. All right, this should work. I'm like a walking office. I get everything in my computer bag. So, all right, let's begin simply by. Here, I can put it back here. By kind of looking at some maps and seeing. I always like maps because they help us to. To really see the context better than just talking. These are kind of 3 maps that represent pretty much where we're going in this conflict. I'm not going to get into 1947, 1948, that whole background. You could go back even much further. But this was the partition plan of 1947 that was adopted by the United Nations. And in this plan, the idea was to partition. Now, this country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is really one country. Jews call it the land of Israel. Palestinians call it Palestine. Religious people call it the Holy Land. Whatever you want to call it, more or less, this is a single country, and all the internal divisions, as you can see over the years, really are temporary and don't mean very much. So the idea was in 1947 that there were 2 peoples living in this country. Jews represented by the Zionist movement that were working for a Jewish state, and Palestinian Arabs that had never had a state actually of their own. And so the idea in the UN was to partition the country. Now, the partition wasn't exactly fair. And again, I'm not going to get into details, because at this time, the Palestinian Arab population was 2/3 of the country. The vast majority of the Jews, who were 1/3 of the population by 1947, had only come in the last 20, 30 years. You know, especially since the end of World War I. And of course, with the rise of the economic problems in Poland, with the rise of Hitler and so on, you had an influx. So the vast majority of the Jews that were there were only there for a few years. But the Jews were much more, the Zionist movement was much more attuned to European diplomacy. You know, the Jews were Europeans for the most part, and therefore they were able to parley, even though they were few in number, parley their strength into a certain diplomatic strength, so that what I'm saying is, in 1947, in the partition, the Jews, who were 1/3 of the population, got 56% of the land. This whole area here that's in beige, 56% of the land was given to the Jewish community, and only 42% of the land, in kind of gray here, the colors aren't so great, but in gray here, 42% of the land was given to the Palestinians, the other 2% being Jerusalem and Bethlehem, together, that were to be internationalized. And that was the partition, so that, in a sense, the native population, that was 2/3 of the population, only got 42% of the land. And the Zionist movement accepted this partition plan. It was a great deal. We're 1/3 of the population, fairly newcomers, and we get 56% of the country. The Palestinian Arabs, of course, refused the partition, and that's always held against them. That's one of the arguments that's always used. You see, the Jews wanted peace, and the Arabs never wanted peace, and if they had accepted the partition plan, they would have had 46%. Today they're fighting for 22%, and they'll get a smaller percentage, and they're da-da-da-da-da. But if we put this within a colonial context, you know, and this is within a colonial context, there was no reason whatsoever why the Palestinian Arabs should have accepted that partition plan. In other words, the idea that this was probably, I think, certainly one of the only cases, if not the only case, in the process of decolonization, where the colonized people did not get their country back, but rather the colonizing powers, and here you might even say the whole League of Nations that had given Britain the mandate into the UN, were colonizing powers in a sense, gave the country over to another people, which is the Jews coming with the Zionist movement.
What was the total population at that time?
Total population was about 1.5 million at that time. All right, anyway, there's a lot of issues to go into here. You know, did the UN even have the authority to partition the country? And there's another real issue, and that is that it was clear that ethnic cleansing was going to take place. That was very clear, and Ben-Gurion was very upfront about that. Ben-Gurion said already in the 30s and 40s that unless there's a Jewish majority of 85% in this country, there can't be a Jewish state. And the problem with Zionism, and I won't get into all of this again, but the problem with Zionism was that it had, until today, an exclusive claim to the land of Israel. In other words, had the Jews come to Palestine, to the land of Israel, and said, look, we see this as our national homeland, we want to revive our national language of Hebrew, we want the Hebrew University here, we're persecuted, we want a refuge, a place to come back, but we recognize and acknowledge that there is another people living in this country. Now, how can we work this out? I don't believe the conflict was inevitable. It might not have been easy. You know, binational states aren't always easy states to manage. But I think that could have been, that could have possibly worked out. Instead, what happened, and like I say, until today, this is the thrust of Israeli policy, is that the Zionist movement came in and said, this is our country. This is the land of Israel. This is not Palestine. There are no Palestinians. There is no people. I mean, there's a lot of Arabs living here. Yeah, we're not blind. I mean, you see, there's a lot of Arabs here, but they don't add up to a collectivity, to a people that has rights of self-determination to this country like we do. And it was that exclusive claim that made the conflict inevitable. Because even though the Palestinians were willing to deal with the Zionist movement, they couldn't obviously accept the fact that they're going to lose more than half of their country, if not more. And therefore you had the war in 1948, without getting into it. Israel was also, this is something else that comes out of 48, was always a strong party. It was not the weak little Jewish nerdy kid in the tough neighborhood like we like to present, but Israel was always a strong party. And there's even something else interesting, because this is the map that emerges from 1948, and that is that actually Israel went into the war in 1948 together with Jordan. In other words, this whole idea of an Arab-Israeli conflict is nonsense. Because in fact, Israel and Jordan had agreed more or less to this partition that exists today, or sort of exists today, even before the war. The idea was that the Hashemites of Jordan would come in and take what we call the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Israel would be established here. And in fact, the only country that really seriously invaded in 1948, the only Arab country, was Syria. But the Syrians didn't invade as so much against Israel as against Jordan, because they were outflanked. The British had created this Jordan with a Hashemite king, and Iraq. That was an artificial country, a British creation, also with a Hashemite king. Because he had a couple of spare princes in the Arabian desert. And Syria was really concerned with getting, in a pincher movement, kind of getting squeezed out and so on. So in other words, there's a whole contest here, a whole context that isn't only Israelis and Palestinians. There's a lot of other stuff. And in fact, the Palestinians really didn't have that much to do with the war. I mean, there was resistance on the part of the Palestinians, but they weren't well organized, and there was an exodus. And then, of course, in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were actually driven out of the country. And you have the creation of the refugee issue that's still alive. And this becomes the map after 48, where Israel is now on 78% of the country, instead of 56%, and the Palestinians again lose, because the West Bank was taken by Jordan, and Gaza was taken by Egypt. What's interesting is the only place, just a little thought, that Jordan and Israel actually fought with each other was in East Jerusalem, in the Old City, because they couldn't agree. They agreed on everything else except the Old City, and that's where they fought. And Jordan won the Battle of Jerusalem, and one other place here in Latrun, where Jordan also beat the Israeli forces. Otherwise, there was really collusion, and there's a fellow named Avi Shleim, an Israeli historian, who has a book called Collusion Across the Jordan, who talks about this. Okay, 1967 comes, and Israel takes the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, and they become the occupied territories. that we talk about today. And this becomes a map of what we call the two-state solution. And the Palestinians begin to come back into the picture. The PLO is founded under Arafat in the early 1960s. And by 1988, the Palestinians accept the two-state solution. The Palestinian vision, until today, is of one state. Palestinians never really accepted the two-state or other ideas. They always see this in terms of one inclusive state, but are willing to accept the two-state solution, even though they see it as a stage towards eventually the unification of the entire country. Not as a trick, but as a process that will take place. But in 1988, in other words, more than 20 years ago, the Palestinians accepted the idea that, okay, if we can get a state on the 22% of historic Palestine that are the occupied territories, we will recognize the state of Israel on the 78% of the country that remains. In other words, you often hear about Ehud Barak's generous offer at Camp David, which is really an urban myth. There never was anything like that. But you never hear about the Palestinians' generous offer that said to Israel, we are half the population of this country today is Palestinian. Half the population. And that doesn't include the 4 million refugees. Today there are 4 million refugees from the 700,000 living in camps and in the countries around. So that if even some of those refugees return, there will be a Palestinian majority in this country. And yet the Palestinians said to Israel, we will give up political claim to 78% of the country. Even though we'll be the majority population, in return for the 22% that remains, that should be a Palestinian state. Pretty good deal. And yet Israel said no. So one of the questions is why? In other words, if Israel truly wants peace and security, which is what it's always telling us, it appears that could have had that 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, before Madrid, before the Oslo process, before Annapolis, before the roadmap, before all, I don't even know where we are today, post-roadmap, before all of that, Israel could have had its own state recognized on 78% of the country. And that generous offer was reconfirmed or reaffirmed by the entire Arab League, that in 2002 unanimously accepted the two-state idea, which is still on the table. And subsequently, the 53 member state organization of Islamic states also accepted the two-state solution. So the two-state solution, you might say, is the accepted solution. It's accepted by the Palestinians, accepted by the entire Arab and Muslim worlds. It's accepted by the international community. This is the basis, supposedly, of American policy. And it's the basis of what we call the roadmap, which was the last diplomatic initiative of the quartet. The United States, Europe, Russia, and the UN as the rump member, which tells you where the UN is these days. So that everybody, in a sense, agrees that this is a solution. I'll even go further. And I'll say that the majority of Israeli Jews accept the two-state solution. Matter of fact, there was something in Haaretz, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago, that 65 to 70% of Israeli Jews would accept this solution as well. So what's the problem? Why don't we, tomorrow morning, sit down and end this damn conflict? The problem is the Israeli governments. Whether they're Labour or Likud or Kadima, whatever they are, there's three, and I'll say this really quickly, there are three directions or three directions in which are pushing for what we call Greater Israel, an Israeli control over the entire country. One force is, of course, the settlers. These are religious Jews coming from, not all the settlers, but the ones that you know, the crazy ones you're always watching on TV. The religious settlers that say God gave us this country, it's all our country, and it's the land of Israel, and Arabs out. So they're not very large in number. I would say that there may be 60, 70,000 of them, out of a Jewish population of about 5.5 million. In other words, only about 1% or so of Israeli Jews are represented by the settlers. But they have disproportionate power because they have political parties behind them. And that gives them a lot of clout in the government. The second direction in which this greater land of Israel comes out of is nationalist. The nationalist direction. Begin, Sharon, Netanyahu all believe in the greater land of Israel, but they're not religious in any way. They're secular. And so you've got this whole nationalistic idea coming out of a right-wing Zionism, but not only, also out of labor Zionism, that says, yes, this is all the land of Israel and it's ours. And the third direction is the military. The Labor Party is a military party. It's always been. You never needed a military coup in Israel because you simply went from being the chief of staff to being the prime minister, or being a general to being a member in the government. So it's one seamless kind of an old boys network. So that the generals, are what C. Wright Mills used to call crackpot realists. They're real, these are soldiers and they're out there and they know the real world and, But they have a kind of a tunnel vision. They see the entire world that way, without taking in all kinds of other variables. And what happens then is it leads them to a conclusion that the generals have in Israel that says you cannot have a Palestinian state for security reasons. Because, and this is an idea that's been inculcated into generations of Israeli Jews, even before there was an Israel, the idea that the Arabs, because we don't use the word Palestinians, we talk about Arabs because we don't recognize that there's another people in this country. If we use the word Palestinians, we'd be undercutting our own idea that we're the exclusive owners of this country. So the idea is that the Arabs are our permanent enemies. There can never be peace. Now, the way we phrase it, of course, is because of them. We want peace, and Barak's generous offer and everything else, but they're intransigent.